The silence of a high mountain valley in midwinter is unlike any other quiet in the world. It is a heavy, almost physical presence that settles over the landscape, muffling the world in a thick blanket of white that seems to absorb even the memory of sound. Imagine standing outside a small, rough-hewn log cabin, just as the sun begins its shallow climb over the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The air is so thin and cold that it feels like breathing broken glass, stinging the lungs with every inhalation. Your boots crunch on snow that has been frozen so solid it squeaks like dry chalk under your weight. There is no birdsong here, no rustle of leaves, only the distant, hollow croak of a raven perched on a skeletal pine, watching you with an indifference that feels almost personal. This is the world of the 19th century mountain man, a realm where a single careless mistake, a dropped glove, a poorly banked fire, a slight rip in a moccasin is not just an inconvenience, but a silent invitation for the winter to take what is yours. In this frozen isolation, your entire existence is narrowed down to a space barely larger than a modern bedroom. This is the first lesson of the frontier. Survival is a matter of arithmetic, a constant calculation of calories against the cold. Most historical cabins used by trappers and explorers measured roughly 10 by 12 feet. They were built in haste during the late summer or early fall, raised with green logs and sealed with mud and moss before the first true freeze locked the earth away. As you push open the heavy wooden door, the sound of the world changes instantly. The sharp, biting wind fades to a low, rhythmic hiss against the logs, replaced by the internal symphony of the cabin. The steady crackle of a fire fighting for relevance in a stone hearth, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of a man who has learned to exist in a state of constant, quiet vigilance. The interior of the cabin is a map of a man's life and his struggle against the environment. The walls are dark, stained by layers of wood smoke and the lingering scent of pine resin, animal fat, and damp wool. There is no furniture to speak of, only a rough wooden bench, a pile of furs in the corner that serves as a bed, and the tools of the trade leaning against the logs. A long rifle, a sharp-edged axe, and a collection of iron traps. The air inside is warmer than the outside, but it is a relative warmth, one that clings to the hearth and thins out rapidly as you move toward the corners where frost has begun to trace delicate, crystalline patterns along the seams of the logs. To live here is to understand the language of wood and fire. You don't just burn logs, you curate them. Hardwoods like oak or mountain mahogany are saved for the long, deep freeze of the night, while pine and spruce provide the quick, bright heat needed to thaw frozen fingers in the morning. Every morning begins with the same ritual, a sequence of movements performed with a focus that borders on the religious. Before the light has fully entered the valley, you must tend to the fire. You stir the embers, breathing life back into the coals that have spent the night glowing like tired eyes. You add small slivers of kindling, watching the blue smoke curl upward into the dark throat of the chimney. Only when the flame is steady do you allow yourself to move. You rub your hands together, feeling the sting of blood returning to your fingertips, a sensation that mountain men often described as 1,000 tiny needles. Touch becomes your most reliable source of information. You learn to read the temperature of the cabin with your skin, feeling the subtle shifts in air pressure that signal a coming storm, or the rare, dangerous arrival of a midwinter thaw. Food in the winter camp is not a matter of pleasure, but of fuel. You reach for a strip of dried meat, buffalo jerky or elk venison, prepared months ago when the sun was still high and the grass was green. It is tough, requiring long minutes of chewing to soften, but it is rich in the fats necessary to keep the body's internal furnace burning. In the journals of early explorers, there is a recurring emphasis on the importance of tallow and marrow. Lean meat alone cannot sustain a man in sub-zero temperatures. It is the fat that provides the endurance. You might melt a small pot of snow over the fire, watching the ice collapse into water, a precious liquid in a world where every stream is locked under a foot of ice. You drink it warm, letting the heat settle in your chest, and for a few minutes the cabin feels like a fortress rather than a cage. The silence outside is a constant companion, one that can eventually play tricks on the mind. Historians often debate the psychological toll of such extreme isolation.
Some suggest that the prolonged lack of human contact led to a state of mountain fever, a quiet delirium where the boundaries between memory and reality began to blur. Others argue that the mountain man's life required a temperament already suited to solitude, turning the silence into a tool for heightened awareness. Regardless of the internal state, the external reality was of absolute self-reliance. You are the only doctor, the only engineer, and the only protector within 100 miles. If a log shifts in the wall or the roof groans under the weight of a fresh snowfall, it is your hands that must fix it, often in the dark and always in the cold. The construction of these cabins was a masterpiece of necessity over aesthetics. The roof was usually sloped steeply to shed the heavy snows of the high Rockies, though sometimes the weight became so great that it required constant clearing with a wooden spade. The logs were notched roughly, the gaps filled with chinking, a mixture of mud, clay, and animal hair that would freeze into something resembling rock. As the winter progressed, the logs would shrink and expand with the temperature cycles, opening new cracks that had to be filled immediately to keep the drafts at bay. You become an expert at sensing these leaks, feeling a thin, invisible finger of cold air reaching across the room to steal the warmth from your hearth. You pack more mud into the seam, knowing it will be frozen solid within the hour, a temporary fix in a life defined by temporary solutions. The relationship with fire is perhaps the intimate bond a mountain man shares. It is a living thing that must be fed and watched. During the day, you keep it low to conserve wood, but as the shadows lengthen and the temperature outside begins its rapid plummet toward 30 or 40 below,
leather, tending the fire, that kept a man anchored to his humanity. These cabins were not just shelters, they were monuments to the human ability to adapt and endure. Today, we might see the lifestyle as boring or repetitive, but for those who lived it, that repetition was the very rhythm of life itself. It was the steady heartbeat of a survivor in a world that didn't care if he lived or died. As you imagine that last wisp of smoke curling away into the spring air, you realize that the silence of the mountain wasn't empty after all. It was full of the quiet, persistent echo of a man who refused to be moved. Every evening, as the light fails, the interior of the cabin transforms. The orange glow from the hearth casts long, flickering shadows across the log walls, turning the rough-hewn wood into a landscape of golden highlights and deep, velvety blacks. The corners of the room disappear entirely, leaving only the central circle of warmth where you sit. This is the hour of reflection. You might take out a small, worn book if you have one, or perhaps a journal to record the day's observations, the direction of the wind, the condition of the snow, the scarcity of game. These records were often the only legacy these men left behind, a collection of practical data mixed with occasional flashes of profound loneliness. You write slowly, your hand cramped from the day's labor, the scratching of the quill the only sound in the room. The smell of the cabin becomes even more intense in the evening heat. The damp logs begin to steam slightly, releasing a pungent aroma of cedar and spruce. The furs you were wrapped in have a heavy animal scent that is both comforting and primal. You lean back against the stones of the hearth, feeling the stored heat soaking into your spine. This is a luxury that cost hours of labor, hauling logs through waist-deep snow, swinging the heavy axe until your shoulders burned, and carefully stacking the split wood to keep it dry. Every degree of warmth in this cabin is earned. There is no thermostat to turn, no effortless energy to tap into. Here, heat is a commodity, more valuable than the gold or silver other men seek in the mountains. Sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, the wind will shift and the cabin will begin to sing. The air whistles through the tiny gaps in the logs and moans around the chimney, creating a series of low, haunting notes that sound like a distant choir. To a novice, this sound might be terrifying, a reminder of the vast, indifferent power of the storm outside. But to the experienced mountain man, it is a diagnostic tool. You listen to the pitch and intensity of the wind, judging the strength of the gale and the direction of the snow. If the note becomes too high, it means a new leak has opened in the chinking. If the moan in the chimney turns to a roar, you know the fire is drawing too much air and needs to be dampened. You are a conductor, and the cabin is your instrument,
and together you play the long, slow symphony of survival. Sleep is never a deep dive into unconsciousness. It is a shallow, watchful state. You learn to interpret every creak of the logs and every pop of the fire. A sudden silence from the hearth is enough to wake you, a signal that the embers are dying and the cold is beginning to reclaim the room. You roll out of your furs, the air hitting your skin like a physical blow, and quickly add more wood. You watch the sparks dance for a moment, a brief firework display in the darkness, before settling back down. This cycle repeats night after night, a rhythmic interruption that defines your existence. You don't fight it, you accept it as the price of staying alive. There is a specific kind of beauty in this hardship, one that is often missed in the romanticized versions of frontier life. It is the beauty of the essential. In this cabin, there is nothing that does not have a purpose. Every scrap of leather, every iron nail, every ounce of fat is used and reused. This economy of existence creates a sense of profound clarity. You don't worry about the complexities of the distant world, the politics of cities, or the fashions of the East. Your world is the 3 steps from the bed to the fire, the weight of the axe in your hand, and the horizon seen through a small, frost-covered window. There is a peace in this narrowing of focus, a stillness that matches the landscape outside. As the weeks of midwinter turn into the long stretch of late February, you might find your mind wandering to the outside. You think about the people you once knew, the sound of many voices speaking at once, the clatter of wagons on cobblestones. Those memories feel like they belong to a different person, a shadow self from a past life. The man you are now is a creature of the mountains, defined by the frost on his beard and the calluses on his palms. You realize that when you finally return to civilization, you will carry this silence with you. It has become a part of your internal architecture, a quiet room you can retreat to when the world becomes too loud. The cabin itself seems to age with you through the winter. The logs settle further into the earth, the mud chinking cracks and is patched, and the stones of the hearth grow darker with soot. It is no longer just a structure, it is a shared history. You know every knot in the floorboards and every stain on the rafters. You have seen this place at its best, filled with the warmth of a roaring fire, and at its worst, when the wind threatened to pull the roof from the walls. This intimacy with your surroundings is a fundamental part of the mountain man's experience. He didn't just inhabit the wilderness, he integrated with it, his life and his shelter becoming a single cohesive unit of survival. In the late winter, the cabin fever can become a physical weight. The walls seem to move closer and the ceiling feels lower. You find reasons to step outside, even when the cold is at its peak. You stand in the snow and look up at the stars, which burn with a brilliance and a clarity that you never see in the lowlands. The constellations are your map and your calendar, their slow rotation marking the inevitable passage towards spring. You watch the Great Bear circle the pole, a silent sentinel in the sky that mirrors your own watchful presence in the valley. For a few minutes, the vastness of the universe makes your own struggles feel small and manageable, and you return to the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. The final weeks before the thaw are a test of endurance. Your woodpile is low, your food supplies are dwindling, and your body is lean and tired. But there's a new energy in the air. You see the first signs of the birds returning, a hardy jay or a small gray nuthatch. Their presence is a promise. You begin to prepare for the spring hunt, cleaning your gear with an intensity that matches your morning fire ritual. You check your moccasins, sewing on new soles made from thick buffalo hide to protect your feet from the coming mud and slush. Every action is a step towards a new season, a slow awakening from the long hibernation of winter. When the thaw finally arrives, it is a sensory explosion. The sound of the first thunder, the smell of wet earth, the sight of green grass appearing under the receding snow, all of it hits you with a force that is almost overwhelming after months of sensory deprivation. You open the cabin door and leave it open, letting the fresh, moist air wash through the room. You stand on the threshold, halfway between your winter refuge and the world beyond, and for the first time in months, you feel the sun as a warm pressure on your face. You have survived. You have kept the fire burning, the roof standing, and the silence at bay. As you walk away from the cabin heading towards the lower valleys where the elk are gathering, you carry the lessons of the winter with you. You have learned that survival isn't about strength, but about attention. You have learned that the smallest things, a dry match, a handful of fat, a well-placed log, are the most important. And you have learned that the silence of the mountain isn't something to be feared, but something to be understood. You move into the spring with a new kind of confidence, the quiet, steady assurance of a man who has looked into the cold, dark eyes of winter and didn't blink. The cabin will remain behind, a skeletal reminder of a season spent on the edge, slowly being reclaimed by the forest until it is nothing more than a memory and a mound of earth, a silent testament to the enduring spirit of the mountain man.
You bank it high. You learn to sleep in snatches, waking every few hours to add a fresh log, a reflex so ingrained that it happens almost without conscious thought. There are accounts of men who survived entire winters sleeping with their boots on, not for warmth, but because frozen leather becomes impossible to wear. They would huddle as close to the stones as they dared, wrapped in layers of buffalo robes and wolf pelts, their breath forming a layer of frost on the very furs that protected them. In this landscape, the passage of time is measured not by clocks, but by the depletion of the woodpile and the shifting colors of the sky. A clear, deep blue sky usually meant the most intense cold, while a heavy, gray overcast signaled the arrival of more snow. You spend your afternoons in the boring work of maintenance. You sharpen your knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape filling the quiet room. You inspect your traps, ensuring the springs are free of rust and the triggers move smoothly. You might spend an hour mending a tear in a buckskin shirt, using a bone needle and sinew thread, your movements slow and deliberate. There is no reason to hurry. In the winter, speed is a waste of energy, and energy is life. Loneliness in a winter cabin isn't a sharp pain, it's a dull ache that eventually becomes part of the background. You might find yourself talking to the fire or giving names to the mice that inevitably find their way inside, drawn by the warmth and the scraps of food. They are small thieves, but in the absolute stillness, they're scratching behind the logs as a reminder that you are not the only living thing in the valley. You learn to tolerate them, just as you learn to tolerate the smoke that lingers near the ceiling when the wind pushes back down the chimney. Smoke is a constant presence, stinging the eyes and flavoring everything you eat. To a mountain man, a smokeless cabin was a cold cabin, and he would gladly trade a bit of lung irritation for the steady radiation of heat. Hunting and trapping in midwinter is a different game than in the fall. The animals have retreated to the timber or moved to lower elevations. You follow their tracks in the deep powder, your snowshoes making a soft huff-huff sound with every step. You look for the telltale signs of life, the browse lines on the willows, the scat of a lynx, the hollowed-out snow where a grouse has burrowed for the night. Trapping is more about patience than pursuit. You set your lines along the frozen creek beds, hoping for a beaver or a marten whose fur is thick and valuable this time of year. Checking the traps is a brutal necessity, requiring you to leave the safety of the cabin for hours at a time, exposed to the raw power of the mountain air. When you return, the warmth of the cabin feels like a physical embrace, a reward for another day survived. As the months grind on, the landscape begins to change in subtle ways. The snow builds up against the sides of the cabin, eventually reaching the eaves, effectively burying the structure and providing a layer of natural insulation. From the outside, the cabin might look nothing more than a hummock in the snow, identified only by the thin ribbon of blue smoke rising from the chimney. Inside, the world grows even quieter, the thick snowpack acting as a sound barrier. This is the heart of winter, the time when the supplies are at their lowest and the cold is at its most persistent. You move as little as possible, sitting by the fire and letting your thoughts drift. You remember the rendezvous of the previous summer, the noise, the laughter, the taste of fresh berries and roasted meat.
Those memories are as important as the firewood, a mental reserve of warmth to get you through the darkest nights of February. The transition from winter to spring is not an event, but a slow, messy process. It begins with a change in the air, a subtle softening of the wind, and a slight increase in the humidity. You notice it first in the sound of the trees. The frozen branches no longer clack together like dry bones, but begin to regain a hint of flexibility. Then comes the big drip. During the day, the sun gains enough strength to melt the surface of the snow on the roof, creating a steady, rhythmic dripping that signals the end of the deep freeze. At night, it freezes again, forming long, jagged icicles that hang like crystal daggers from the eaves. This is a dangerous time. The melting snow makes the ground unstable, and the rising temperatures can trigger avalanches on the surrounding slopes, their thunderous roar echoing through the valley like distant artillery. Inside the cabin, the thaw brings its own challenges. The dirt floor becomes damp, and the mud chinking starts to soften and fall away. The air grows heavy and musty, filled with the scent of wet wood and old ash. You spend your days clearing the snow away from the door and digging channels to lead the meltwater away from your foundation. It is exhausting work, but it is fueled by a new sense of hope. You see the first patches of bare earth appearing near the base of the pines, dark and wet and full of promise. You check your traps one last time, knowing the fur will soon begin to thin as the animals prepare for the warmer months. When you finally pack your gear to leave the cabin, you don't look back with nostalgia, but with a quiet respect. This small, dark space was your world for half a year. It held the worst of the winter at bay and provided a place for you to exist when the rest of the world was frozen solid. You leave the remaining wood piles for whoever might find this place next, a silent tradition of the frontier. As you move down the valley, the sound of running water, the first true sound of spring, rises to meet you. The ice on the streams is breaking up, great slabs of it grinding together as the current regains its strength. The air is no longer a blade, but a gentle pressure, and as the first green shoots of grass push through the receding snow, you realize that you have once again successfully negotiated your place in the high country. The story of the mountain man in winter is a story of the power of routine. In the face of overwhelming odds and absolute isolation, it was the mundane tasks, splitting wood, mending,